the greatest Soulsvania ever or the biggest Souls-like imposter? To this day, it's still debated whether or not Hollow Knight is really a Souls-like game. I even took to Twitter to ask my followers if it is indeed a Souls-like, and their responses really paint the picture of how divisive gamers are on this topic. It can be answered with one question: does it have a stamina bar? Souls Light is more like it. Yes, it's a Souls-like Metroidvania. No, it's a Metroidvania. It's a Metroidvania with a teaspoon of Souls added in. It is, but it isn't. No, you die, lose currency, have to backtrack, enemies respawn. Yes, it's a Souls-like. Yes, yup. Kind of, but not exactly. Kind of, but not exactly. That sounds like my answer, but I decided to reinstall the game and take a trip down memory lane to discover why Hollow Knight was called a Souls-like in the first place. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to 2017 when Hollow Knight released. This was 2 years after Bloodborne and just a year after Dark Souls 3. And 2017 is often brought up as one of the greatest years in gaming. And even more specifically, this year can be argued as the start of Souls-like games really gaining some steam and becoming a reality. There's two big reasons for this: Nioh and The Surge, which both released in 2017. This had many of us, myself included, on board with the idea of Souls-inspired games and them actually being good enough to compare to the original Dark Souls series. The Souls-like formula was really starting to show itself in non-From Software games. Losing souls when you die, bonfires, stamina bars, Souls-like builds, and of course, the difficult bosses and enemies. The problem was at the time, and this is probably because it was such a buzz term to use and such a new idea, journalists and gamers alike started to attribute the term Souls-like to basically any game of any genre just because it was difficult. The term Souls-like was being thrown around at just about anything, and I even made a video back then about how ridiculous it was to compare just any challenging game to Dark Souls. Crash Bandicoot had just released, and it was being described as just like Dark Souls because it was difficult. That same year, Cuphead released, and that was also described as the Dark Souls of platformers. It looked and played nothing like Dark Souls, but because it was difficult, the media would say it's like Dark Souls. It became such a meme at this point that this exists. And what made the Dark Souls correlation go even further is that you had an actual journalist by the name of Dean Takahashi, and he had a video of him struggling on the tutorial of Cuphead. Yeah, you remember that? Gosh, what a time to be alive. This, in my opinion, is what really started the narrative of journalist mode and them needing easy modes. And this is a narrative that is still going strong today. So with all that considered, imagine this little 2D indie Metroidvania called Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight, get it? It comes along and it happens to have small Souls elements in it. We saw that we lose our currency when we die, we collect souls to use abilities, the enemies respawn after we save, it's challenging as hell, and even more importantly, it just looks the part. The atmospheres are very dark, the world is interconnected, and here we are fighting with a sword and then resting at a bench to save the game. Oh, that's like a bonfire, so it must be like Dark Souls, right? It makes sense that in a climate that we were in 2017, while people were using ridiculous examples like Crash Bandicoot or Cuphead, that we'd naturally give the Souls-like title to Hollow Knight instead. If this was 2024, it would be far less likely we would describe it as a Souls-like, but in 2017, standards were different. We didn't have Code Vein yet. Mortal Shell wasn't here yet. Remnant didn't exist. And to a more specific degree, we didn't have the 2D Soulsvanias that we have now. Blasphemous, Grime, The Last Faith, these games did not exist yet. The only game we could really compare to that was well known was Salt and Sanctuary. But because Hollow Knight came out in 2017 and we were on this wave of comparing everything to Souls like the media was doing, we essentially prematurely grouped Hollow Knight into the conversation of Souls-like games. Even on Steam, users were using the Souls tag, and it's still there today. I guess when it comes down to it, we really can't blame ourselves for believing it was a Souls-like. I mean, just look at it. But in 2024, we now know better and realize that those looks were deceiving. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania, through and through, which wasn't even the developer's intention at the time. It just ended up that way. There was no intention or inspiration from Dark Souls either, as interviews from that time tell that the developers hardly played any Dark Souls and did not credit it as an inspiration. So ultimately, this is a matter of great minds thinking alike. They made Hollow Knight as great as it is, and it just happens to have some Souls-like elements. But are they enough to make it a Soulsvania, like that of Last Faith, or Blasphemous, or Grime? These games have showed us what true Soulsvania looks like, which has evolved the standards and the definition. Now that we're in 2024, Hollow Knight just doesn't fit that description like it used to. And we may have been too quick to give the Souls-like tag to Hollow Knight just simply because there wasn't a whole lot to compare to like there is today.